They told me my grandson died in a fire 3 years ago. I buried a small white coffin. Then one morning my daughter-in-law stood on my porch with a boy and said, "James is home." I held that child's wrist for 3 seconds, and 30 years of nursing told me what they didn't want me to know. So I smiled, and I started counting everything. Stay with me until the end, because they picked the wrong grandmother. The quilt was spread across my sewing chair the way I left it every evening. 37 squares of fabric, each one cut from something that had belonged to someone I loved. James's baby blanket in the center. Earl's Sunday shirt along the left border. A scrap from the dress I wore the day Marcus was born. I wasn't working on it anymore, hadn't touched a needle in 3 years. I just needed it near me, the way some women need a glass of something strong. My name is Vera Mae Tilson. I'm 65 years old, and I live in a house in Natchez, Mississippi that my late husband Earl built with his own hands the year we got married. The walls hold 42 years of living. A kitchen that still smells like the coffee Earl drank every morning at 5. A back porch where Marcus used to sit and do his homework in the summers. A sewing room where I spent 30 years of evenings, the way other women spend evenings watching television. Earl died 12 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much time to say what needs saying. I had him for 3 months after the diagnosis. We used every one of those days. Marcus, my son, died 5 years ago. A pickup truck ran a red light on Highway 61 just outside Port Gibson. He was 38 years old. He had his father's laugh and his grandmother's stubbornness and a little boy at home who had both. That little boy was James. James Earl Tilson was born 8 weeks early, small enough that the nurses let me hold him in one cupped hand. He spent 3 weeks in the NICU at Natchez Regional, inside a plastic incubator with wires running in and out of him. I sat beside that incubator every day. I brought my sewing basket because I needed something to do with my hands. I stitched the center square of his quilt during those 3 weeks. Ivory fabric, yellow thread, a phrase I chose the night he arrived, and they told me it would be a while before they knew anything for certain. You are found always. I never explained it to anyone. Diane asked once, when James was 4, what it meant. I said it was an old family saying. She accepted that. James never asked. He simply knew it, the way children know things their grandmothers choose to tell them in the quiet hours. He used to trace the letters with his finger every time I brought the quilt out. He knew the feel of it before he could read. He also had a birthmark on the inside of his right wrist, a port wine stain, deep reddish purple, the size of a silver dollar. I called it his angel mark the first time I saw it, because it looked like something left behind to say, "This one matters. Hold on to this one." James liked that. He would press my thumb over it sometimes when he was small, matching my skin to his. The sewing room was quiet that evening. October had come in cool and slow the way October does in Natchez, and I had the window cracked just enough to hear the pecan tree moving in the yard. I was reading, or trying to. The book was face down in my lap, and I was looking at the quilt instead. 3 years since the fire. 3 years since the school called Diane, and Diane called me, and I drove to their house on Clifton Avenue and sat in their kitchen while a fire investigator explained what they had found in the ruins of James's bedroom. 3 years since I stood in a funeral home and tried to make decisions about a service for a child I never got to see one last time because they said the remains weren't suitable for viewing. I accepted that. A grieving grandmother accepts what she is told, because grief takes away the part of you that asks questions. 30 years as a school nurse had not taken that part away from me. But grief had. James used to fall asleep on this couch when he visited, one arm tucked under his cheek and the other hanging off the cushion with his fingers just grazing the floor. He slept the way his father slept, completely like sleep was something he trusted. I was thinking about that when the telephone rang. It was Diane. I had not spoken to her in 6 weeks. She had remarried 14 months after the fire, a man named Glenn Hargrove, whom I had met twice at brief, careful gatherings people arrange when they are not sure how the other party will behave. Glenn was pleasant, the way certain men are pleasant, smoothly, efficiently, without leaving much of an impression. I had told my friend Patrice he reminded me of a hotel lobby, comfortable enough, but no one ever seemed to actually live there. Vera Diane said, "I have some news." Her voice had a careful quality, measured and bright at the same time, the way voices get when people have been practicing what they plan to say. "I need to come see you, Glenn and I both. There is someone we want you to meet." I kept my voice even. "Someone?" "It is good news," she said. "It is the best news. I know it is going to be a lot to take in, but please, can we come tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock. I told her yes. I told her I would put on coffee. 10 o'clock was fine. When I hung up the phone, I sat for a long time without moving. The pecan tree shifted outside the window. The quilt lay across the chair with its center square facing up, yellow thread on ivory fabric. 7 words I had chosen in a hospital room when a boy I loved was fighting to breathe. You are found always. The last time someone called to say they had important news about James, they handed me a box of ashes and told me to take all the time I needed. I did not sleep that night. I was up before 5. I made coffee I didn't drink and stood at the kitchen window, watching the light come up over Earl's yard, the fig tree in the corner, the 3 pecan trees along the fence line, the vegetable beds that had gone to weeds since I stopped caring to maintain them and started caring only about not moving from one day to the next. At 9:45, I heard a car in the driveway. There were 3 of them. Glenn came first, which told me something right away. He opened the passenger door for Diane and then turned to the back door for the boy, and he did both things with the same motion, the same courteous efficiency, like a man performing customer service. He had a firm handshake and a warm smile, and eyes that moved over the front of my house the way you scan a room before you commit to it. Diane looked thinner than I remembered. She was wearing a blue dress and had her hair pulled back, and she hugged me at the door with both arms, which she had not done at Earl's funeral or at Marcus's or at any of the half-dozen difficult occasions we had shared over the years. People hug differently when they want something. And then there was the boy. He was about the right height. He had dark hair that James had not had. James took after Marcus, who took after Earl, all of them brown, where this child was nearly black at the roots. But children's hair changed. Diane had said the years, the disruption, the moving around. I told myself these were the kinds of things that could account for differences. I was already telling myself that before he was fully through the door, which told me something about the state I was in. "His name is James," Diane said. She said it the way you say something you have rehearsed, hitting the emphasis just slightly wrong. "I know his name," I said, and I held out my arms. He walked into the hug the way children walk into cold water, carefully braced. James had always run at me with both arms open, like hugging was something you committed to fully or did not attempt. I held this child and kept my hands moving the way I had 10,000 times in 30 years of nursing shoulder blades, upper back. The professional touch that is really an inventory of what the body is telling you. Then I took his right hand in both of mine. The birthmark was there. I will give them credit for that much. But a port wine stain is not a thing you can replicate with precision. It is a vascular anomaly present from birth, individual as a fingerprint, slightly raised in some places, flush in others, the capillaries arranged in a pattern that belongs to one person alone. What was on this child's wrist was smooth, uniformly smooth edges raised all the way around in the manner of something applied rather than grown. I held his hand for 3 seconds. I ran my thumb across the inside of his wrist, the way I used to do when James was small. The gesture James knew, the one that meant, "I see you, and I am glad." The boy flinched. Not much, just enough. 30 years of reading children's bodies does not go away because you retire. I know exactly what I felt in those 3 seconds. I also know that I smiled at that child with every ounce of warmth I had, because 65 years of loving people does not switch off simply because the cause has changed. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, "let me look at you." He stood still and let me look. He was trying hard. I could see the effort in the set of his jaw and the careful way he held his shoulders, like someone who had been coached on posture. His eyes were brown, which James's had been. That part they had managed. "I want to show you something," I said. I led them all to the sewing room. This surprised Glenn. I saw it in the brief rearrangement of his expression, but he recovered quickly and followed. The quilt was on the chair. I lifted it and held it out toward the boy. "I made this the week you were born," I said. "The center square is special. There are words stitched there. Can you read them for me?" He looked at the center square. Ivory fabric, yellow thread, 7 words I had chosen in a hospital room, while a boy I loved was fighting to breathe. He studied it the way you study a test question when you are not sure you were given the right material. "God is always with you," he said finally. I folded the quilt and set it back on the chair. "Close enough, sweetheart," I said, and I gave them the largest smile I had given anyone since the morning of the fire. "I think this calls for coffee," I said, "and I made those biscuits you always liked." Glenn's eyes warmed at that. Diane touched the boy's shoulder and steered him toward the kitchen. I went ahead to put the cups out, and I did not let my hand shake, and I did not let my face do anything it was not supposed to do. That is what 30 years of nursing teaches you. You learn to hold your expression still when the news is bad, to keep your voice level and your hands steady so the child in front of you does not yet know how serious things are. That evening after they left and the house was quiet again, I sat in the sewing room with the quilt across my lap. The boy in my living room was not James. He had the wrong mark and the wrong instincts and the wrong way of coming in from the cold. And he had not known the words. Somewhere out there, my real grandson was alive, and the people who had taken him from me were somewhere in Natchez tonight, believing they had fooled me. They had not. I called Patrice at 11 o'clock that night. Patrice Owens has been my closest friend since we were both 23 years old and new to Natchez and convinced that the South would either make us or break us. She has been married twice and widowed once, and she laughs the way some people breathe without thinking about whether the moment warrants it. She volunteers at 3 different organizations and bakes the best sweet potato pie in Adams County. And she has never once in 42 years told me something just because it was what I wanted to hear. I told her everything. I told her about the car pulling into the driveway at 9:45, about Glenn's eyes moving over my house like an appraiser, about the hug that was too careful, about the 3 seconds I held that child's right wrist in both of my hands and felt what I felt. And the quilt, Patrice said when I got to that part. You showed him the quilt. I did, and he didn't know. He said, God is always with you. A silence from Patrice, the kind that means she is understanding something fully before she speaks about it. Then you smiled at him. I gave them biscuits, I said. Patrice laughed. It was not a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that means you recognize what you are dealing with, and you have decided to stand your ground regardless. Then she said, Vera, how do you know? Not because I doubt you, because you are going to need to be certain. I thought about the 3 seconds. The smooth edges raised all the way around. The flinch when I ran my thumb across it. I thought about the hug and the careful shoulders, and the boy's eyes going to the center square of the quilt and staying there too long. The way you look at something when you are searching for information rather than recognizing something you know. 30 years, I said. I know. Another silence. Then what do you need from me? That was Patrice. She did not ask why or whether I had considered other explanations or whether grief might be playing tricks on a woman who had buried 3 people she loved in 12 years. She asked what I needed. I need you to start volunteering further out, I said. You have been talking about expanding to facilities in Alabama. I need you to go. There is a place in Decatur called Sunrise Youth Services. I need you to find out if there is a boy there who does not belong. Patrice said nothing for a moment. Then, when did you want me to start? As soon as you can manage it without raising suspicion, I said. And I need one more thing. There is a man at First Baptist, Father Beaumont. He runs a pen pal program for children in residential care, connects them with families and community members who write letters. I need to be part of that program. I need a reason to send letters to Alabama that no one would think twice about. Patrice understood. She would talk to Father Beaumont. She would make it natural. And in the meantime, she said, you keep doing what you were doing today. In the meantime, I keep smiling. After we hung up, I sat for a long while in the dark without turning on a light. I held the quilt in my lap and thought about the night I had stitched the center square. James had been in the world for 6 hours, and he was not doing well. The nurses were kind in the way nurses are kind when they are not certain what morning will bring. I had my sewing basket because I had learned in the waiting rooms of the previous 12 years that my hands needed something to do when the rest of me could not move. I thought about what I wanted him to know if he survived and grew old enough to understand it. There had been a Sunday years before Earl got sick when the preacher at First Baptist gave a sermon about the nature of being lost and being found. He talked about it as if lost was a condition you recovered from once, and it was over. I had sat in that pew thinking about Earl's mother, who spent her last 2 years in a mind that no longer knew where home was, and I had thought the preacher was missing something. Being found is not a single moment. It is a promise that has to be renewed. You are found today, and you must be found again tomorrow, and it is the finding that matters more than the state of having been found. You are found always. I stitched those 7 words into the center square of my grandson's quilt while he lay in a plastic incubator with monitors tracking every breath. I never told Diane what they meant. I never explained them to anyone except James when he was old enough to ask. "Grandma, what does found mean?" "It means I will always come for you," I had told him. "No matter where you go or how long it takes, you are found, always." He had pressed my thumb over the angel mark on his wrist, the way he sometimes did, matching my skin to his. I sat in the dark sewing room, and I thought about a boy in Alabama who had not come home yet. I thought about what it meant to have been told for 3 years that there was no one to come for. Patrice had asked before we said goodnight how long I could keep smiling at the child in my living room. "As long as it takes," I told her. "As long as it takes to bring James home." The second morning, Glenn and Diane brought Tyler over. Diane took the boy into the backyard to look at the fig tree. She said James had always loved that tree. Tyler nodded agreeably, which was something I noticed. He had been agreeable about everything since they arrived, nodding and accepting and going along in the way of someone following a script. Real children pushed back sometimes. Real children had opinions about fig trees. Glenn stayed inside with me. He settled onto the sofa with his coffee cup, and he had a way of settling that reminded me of certain men I had seen at school board meetings over the years. Men who were comfortable everywhere because they had decided the room belonged to them. He crossed one leg over the other and asked me how I had been sleeping. "Not well," I told him honestly. I had not slept well in 3 years. He nodded with his whole face, the practiced empathy of a man who had learned that nodding made people trust him. "It must have been an enormous amount to carry," he said. "And now, on top of everything, to have James back, it must be a lot of adjustment." "It is," I agreed. He set his coffee cup down on the table itself, not the coaster I'd put out, the way people do when they are comfortable enough to stop being careful. His eyes moved briefly toward the hallway that led to my office. Just a glance, half a second, and then back to me. "I was wondering," he said, "whether you had given any thought to what comes next. For James, practically speaking, the paperwork side of things." "What sort of paperwork did you have in mind?" I asked. He spread his hands in a gesture meant to convey he was simply a helpful man raising a reasonable matter. "School enrollment," he said. "Health insurance. Eventually, and there is no rush, none at all, the question of guardianship will need to be sorted out officially." James has been in the system for 3 years under another name. Getting his identity restored is going to require coordination. "I understand," I said. "That sounds complicated." "It is a little, but that is why I want to help. Diane and I both want to make sure you are not carrying this alone." I smiled at him over my coffee cup. He glanced toward the hallway again. This time his eyes went slightly further past the office doorway, toward the corner where the old filing cabinet stood. Earl had bought that cabinet the year we married. I had kept 37 years of documents in it: insurance policies, property deeds, Earl's will, the abstract of title for the 40 acres outside town that Earl's father had bought in 1951 and that had sat untouched ever since gaining in value, the way land does when nobody disturbs it. Glenn was looking at that cabinet the way I had seen certain children look at things they wanted but had been told they could not have yet. Not greedily, just with intention. I thought of something Marcus said to me once. He had been about 12, sitting at the kitchen table while I graded papers, and he said, "Mom, do you know you notice everything? Like I'll be talking and I can see you see something behind me and file it away, and you never say anything about it, but you always know." I told him it was a nursing habit. Pay attention to what the body is doing while the mouth is talking, because the body is usually more honest. Marcus had considered this. "Then does it bother people that you see them?" "Only the ones who don't want to be seen," I said. Glenn did not want to be seen, so I gave him nothing to react to. I told him I was grateful for the help. I told him it was a relief to have someone willing to handle the practical side of things. I asked whether he took sugar in his coffee. He said no. I got up to refill his cup anyway, and when I passed the hallway, I did not look toward the filing cabinet, because I did not need to. I knew what was in it. I also knew that Glenn did not know I knew what he was looking for. We were in the middle of talking about nothing in particular. He had moved on to the weather and the pleasantness of Natchez in October when a knock came at the front door. It was Nola Washington from next door. Nola had lived beside me for 19 years and was a member of my quilting circle and had the kind of eyes that missed very little about her own street. She was carrying a covered casserole dish, which was the excuse women of a certain age use when they want to see something without explaining why they need to see it. She looked at Glenn sitting on my sofa. Then she looked at me. I held her gaze for one moment. Then I gave her the smallest possible shake of my head. Not yet. Nola said what a nice surprise to find me with company, and how she had made too much chicken and rice, and would I mind taking some? I thanked her warmly. Glenn stood and introduced himself with the smooth handshake and the careful smile, and Nola received it with the particular courtesy of a Southern woman who has decided she does not like someone but sees no reason to announce it. After she left, I carried the casserole to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment with my back to the room. Glenn was watching me. They always watch when they think you are not paying attention. I was paying attention to everything. The week settled into a shape I had not anticipated. Glenn and Diane did not move in. They were renting at the Comfort Inn on Liberty Road. But they came every morning and stayed through supper and sometimes past it. And Tyler slept in the guest room 3 nights out of 7, which Glenn said was to help James readjust to being in a family home again. I cooked the things James had loved. On Monday, I made red beans and rice with andouille sausage because James used to eat 3 helpings and then lie on the living room floor and say he was dying of happiness. Tyler ate 1 polite serving and asked if he could be excused. I told him, "Of course, sweetheart." I watched him carry his plate to the sink and thought James would have been on the floor by now. On Wednesday, I made sweet potato biscuits and told Tyler that his grandfather Earl had taught his father Marcus the recipe, and Marcus had taught me the right way to make them, which was with more butter than anyone would consider reasonable. Tyler listened with courteous attention and said they were very good. James, at age 6, had stolen 4 off the cooling rack before I could stop him, burned his fingers, cried, and then stolen a 5th. I noted all of this in the small green notebook I had started keeping in the drawer of my nightstand. The notebook had been Patrice's idea. Write down everything she had said, every detail you notice about the boy, and every word Glenn says, and every time his eyes go somewhere they should not. You are not going to remember all of it when it matters. And it is going to matter. I wrote down the way Glenn sat each morning, where his eyes went in my house, and in what order, and for how long. I wrote down the things he said about the paperwork and the guardianship, and the careful, incremental way he was building a picture of my finances. I had started forgetting things in front of him, nothing alarming, just small things. Where I had put the sugar bowl, whether I had paid the electric bill. The kind of details that concern a person who is deciding whether an elderly woman can manage her own affairs. Glenn had started helping me find the sugar bowl. It was working. I could see it in the way he moved through my house, now slightly less careful than he had been in the first 2 days, as if he had taken a measurement and found the walls thinner than he expected. He refilled his own coffee some mornings without asking. He picked up the mail off the porch one afternoon and sorted through it and set it on the counter by the telephone, which was not something I had invited him to do. I thanked him warmly for all of it. Tyler watched these exchanges with the expression of a child sitting through something he did not fully understand. He was 11 years old and had been asked to do a sustained and complicated thing, and over that first week I could see the places where the effort was costing him. He ate his meals neatly and answered questions in full sentences and said, "Yes, ma'am," when I asked him to do something which James had almost never done. James had said, "Sure," or "Okay," or sometimes just looked at me and gone to do the thing the way children do when the relationship is settled enough that they do not need to perform inside it. Tyler was performing constantly. I recognized it because I was doing the same thing, and it takes one to know one. One afternoon I found him standing in the doorway of the sewing room. He was looking at the quilt on the chair. He did not touch it. He just stood there with an expression I could not immediately name. And then he heard me in the hall, and his face went back to the agreeable neutral he wore most of the time. I asked if he wanted to come in and look at it more closely. He said no thank you and went back to the living room. I stood in the hallway a moment after he left. There had been something in the way he looked at the quilt that was not performance. I did not know yet what it meant. I added it to the green notebook that evening. On Thursday, a small envelope appeared in my mailbox, thin and pale, tucked against the side of the box, in a way that suggested it had been pushed there rather than delivered. No return address. Natchez postmark, which confused me, and an Alabama origin stamp from Decatur. I took it inside and opened it at the kitchen table. With Glenn in the next room watching a baseball game on the television I had started leaving on in the afternoons, which was part of the performance, Glenn had decided. I watched a great deal of television. Inside the envelope was a single small piece of paper, folded once. The paper had been torn from a notebook, the spiral edge still ragged on one side. On it, in pencil so faint I had to carry it to the window to see clearly, was a drawing. Not words, a drawing. 37 small squares arranged in rows, each one subdivided into the smaller shapes of a patchwork pattern. 7 rows, the center square left blank. My quilt. Every row in the right order, every square in its right place. Drawn from memory by someone who had studied it a long time ago and had not forgotten a single piece. I stood at the kitchen window, holding that paper and the baseball game played in the next room. and I understood something I had not let myself fully believe until that moment. He was alive. He was trying to reach me, and he remembered everything. The hunt. I did not go to bed that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the drawing in front of me and went over it square by square, the way I used to check vaccination records, methodically, starting from the top left corner and working across each row in order. 37 squares, 7 rows of 5, with 2 extra on the final row, because that was how the math had worked out with the fabric I had. The first row, Earl's blue Sunday shirt on the left, the green dress I had worn to Marcus's first school play, a piece of James's first pair of pajamas, yellow with small white stars. The second row, the curtain fabric from the bedroom Earl and I shared for 30 years, a scrap of lace from my mother's tablecloth, a square from Marcus's high school letter jacket. Every square in the drawing matched, every row in the correct order. The center square left blank. The only person alive who had studied that quilt long enough to draw it from memory was James. I called Patrice at 7 in the morning. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. I described the drawing. I told her about the Alabama postmark and the hand delivery, and how the envelope had been pushed into the mailbox rather than dropped through the slot. Father Beaumont, she said immediately. I had thought the same thing. The Pen Pal program ran through First Baptist, and Father Beaumont knew every church volunteer in the county and several in the counties around. Someone in Alabama had put that letter into hands that knew how to get it to me without leaving a record connected to my name. I need to talk to him today, I said. He is expecting you at 2, Patrice said. And Vera, I have been to Decatur. I went still at that. When? 3 days ago. I drove up and back the same day. She had made an 8-hour round trip without telling me she was going. I had known Patrice Owens for 42 years, and she still managed to surprise me. She told me what she had found. Sunrise Youth Services was a residential facility on the eastern edge of Decatur, privately operated, the kind of place that appeared in the county directory between a dry cleaning establishment and an insurance office, and did not draw the eye. It accepted children from the state welfare system and from private placements, families who paid directly outside official channels. The man who ran it was named Bobby Hargrove. Patrice had found his name in the facility's public registration documents, which in Alabama were a matter of county record. Bobby Hargrove, I repeated. Glenn's cousin Patrice said. I checked. They grew up together in Gadsden. Same address on the census for 12 years. I sat with that for a moment. Glenn had not placed James in a random facility. He had placed him with family. Someone who would not ask questions because he already knew the answers and had agreed to the arrangement before James arrived. Patrice had not been able to see the children. The facility required advanced scheduling for any visit, and she had not wanted to raise suspicion by pushing. But she had found that a boy had been admitted in November, 3 years ago, listed in the public records as a private placement under the name Michael Green, age 8 at admission. James had been 8 years old that November. At 2 o'clock, I walked to First Baptist, 6 blocks from my house, which I had attended for 40 years. Father Leonard Beaumont was 62 and had been at the church for 15 of those years. He was the kind of man who, when you sat down across from him, gave you the impression he had already heard whatever you were about to say and had been thinking about how to help you with it. I told him what I needed. Not everything. I did not tell him about Glenn or the filing cabinet or the fire. I told him I had reason to believe there was a child in Decatur, Alabama, who needed to receive letters from someone who cared about him, and that those letters needed to travel through channels not connected to my name or my address. Father Beaumont listened without interruption. Then he said, "The Pen Pal program sends letters through a rotating address of the diocese office in Jackson. Nothing traces back to a private residence." "I understand," I said. He said, "The child's name, Michael Green," I told him, though I do not believe that is the name he answers to in his own mind. Father Beaumont looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of a man deciding how much he needs to know in order to do the right thing. Then he said, "I will make the arrangements. The first letter can go out by Friday." I walked home in the October afternoon with the drawing folded in my coat pocket. Glenn's rental car was in my driveway. The baseball game had started up again on the television inside. I went in through the back door and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking at Earl's fig tree. Somewhere in Decatur, Alabama, a boy had drawn my quilt from memory. He had left the center square blank because he knew what belonged there and understood it was not his to write. He had passed that drawing through hands I did not yet know, through a chain that had found its way to my mailbox, inside a pale envelope with no name on the outside. He was sending me a map. He was telling me he had not forgotten a single square. He was leaving me a trail home, and I had just found the first marker on it. I retrieved the fire report on a Wednesday morning while Glenn and Diane had taken Tyler to the mall to buy shoes. The envelope was in the filing cabinet in my office in the section behind the green divider that held the documents I never wanted to look at but had too much respect for to throw away. Earl's death certificate, Marcus's, the medical examiner's summary from the accident on Highway 61, and behind those, in a white envelope with the Adams County Fire Investigation Division return address that I had been given at the funeral home 3 years ago and had not opened since. I had read it once, the day they gave it to me sitting in a vinyl chair in a carpeted room designed to make difficult things easier by being beige and neutral and climate-controlled. I had read it and understood the words and not been able to hold any of them. Grief does that. It makes you functionally illiterate about the things that matter most. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee and I read it again. The first thing I noticed was the point of origin. In most residential fires, the report would list the kitchen or the utility room or the electrical panel, faulty wiring, a stove left on, the places where fire tends to begin, because those are the places where heat and fuel and chance come together without anyone intending them to. The point of origin in this report was James's bedroom. The investigator had noted it without particular emphasis. Accidental cause, the report read. Point of origin, northwest bedroom, consistent with a candle or small electrical device. The northwest bedroom was James's room, a 6-year-old boy's room, where a child slept who did not own candles and whose small electrical devices consisted of a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship and a tablet computer that charged on the kitchen counter because Diane did not allow it in the bedroom. I made a note in the green notebook. The second thing I noticed was the identification record. James had been seeing the same pediatric dentist since he was 3 years old. Dr. Patricia Odom on Main Street, 4 blocks from Diane's house on Clifton Avenue. I had taken James to Dr. Odom myself a dozen times. Dr. Odom knew James. She had his full records going back to his first lost tooth. The dental identification in the fire report had been performed by a Dr. Carl Ennis of Meridian, Mississippi. Meridian was 90 miles away. Dr. Carl Ennis was not James's dentist and had never been James's dentist, which meant he had no baseline records of his own to compare. He would have been working from records submitted to him by someone else, records that could have been any child's, transferred to a new file with a different name on the folder. The question was, who had submitted those records and where they had come from, because they had not come from Dr. Patricia Odom on Main Street. And any comparison Dr. Ennis had made had been a comparison against a lie. I wrote that down. The third thing I found required me to go to a different drawer where I kept copies of James's medical records. I had always kept copies because Diane was not reliable about paperwork, and 30 years as a school nurse had made me the kind of person who keeps copies of everything. James had been to the pediatrician the August before the fire. He had been weighed and measured and declared healthy. The chart said 61 pounds, which was slightly below average for his age, but consistent with how he had always grown lean and compact, the way Marcus had been. The fire report listed the recovered remains at an estimated 52 pounds. 9 pounds. In a child, 9 pounds is not a rounding error. 9 pounds is the difference between one child and another. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, looking at the number 52. 9 pounds lighter than the boy I had held in my arms at his last birthday. 9 pounds lighter than the child who had eaten 3 helpings of red beans and rice and lain on the floor, saying he was dying of happiness. The fire had been set. The dental records had been switched. The remains in the ground at Jefferson Street Cemetery, in the small white coffin I had chosen, because James once told me his favorite color was white like snow, were not James. They had never been James. Someone had planned this carefully enough to arrange a dentist from another city 90 miles away who would not know the difference between James's real records and ones that had been substituted. Carefully enough to find remains that approximated a child's weight, though not closely enough, because they had assumed no one would go back to the August checkup records and do the arithmetic. I put the fire report back in its envelope. I placed the envelope back behind the green divider. I closed the filing cabinet and sat at the kitchen table and drank the rest of my cold coffee. Through the front window, I could see the street quiet in the Wednesday morning, 2 neighbors walking a dog, a mail truck completing its rounds. An ordinary October day in Natchez, the kind of day where nothing appears to be happening, and everything is. Glenn's rental car would be back in that driveway within the hour. He would come in and ask how I was feeling and whether I needed anything, and I would tell him I was just fine, and he would believe me because I had given him every reason to. The green notebook was open to the page where I had written 3 lines. Point of origin, dentist from Meridian, 9-pound discrepancy. I looked at those lines for a while. Then I added one more at the bottom. Someone had assumed no grieving grandmother would ever check. They had assumed wrong. Patrice made her first visit to Sunrise Youth Services on a Thursday. She had arranged it through the facility's volunteer coordinator. She told them she was with a church outreach program, which was true, and that she was interested in expanding the Pen Pal program to include craft activities, which was true, in the way that most useful fictions are true, meaning it contained enough accuracy to be believed. Sunrise Youth Services occupied a single-story building on a county road outside Decatur, the kind of structure built cheaply and maintained minimally. Aluminum siding gone from white to the color of old cream. A parking lot with more weeds than gravel. Inside, it was cleaner than outside, which was the minimum standard. The furniture was institutional chairs bolted to the floor in the common room, tables with rounded edges, everything in the muted colors selected by someone who believed that nothing should catch the eye. Bobby Hargrove met Patrice at the front desk. She described him to me later on the telephone. Heavy-set, she said, 50 or so, shook her hand like he was doing her a favor. He showed her the common room and the dining area and explained the schedule with the practiced efficiency of someone describing a process rather than a life. The children, when they passed through the hall in small groups, did not look up. Patrice was looking for a boy who fit the description. 11 years old, admitted 3 years ago under the name Michael Green. She saw him in the common room. He was sitting at a table by the window, away from the other children. He had a notebook in front of him and a pencil in his hand, and he was drawing. Not writing, not doing homework. Drawing. Patrice told me she could not see what he was drawing from across the room. But something about the way he held the pencil, careful, deliberate, the way someone works on something that matters, made her slow as she passed that table. His eyes came up when she went by. Brown eyes, watchful and steady, the kind of eyes that had learned to assess adults before deciding whether to speak. She did not stop. She continued the tour and thanked Bobby Hargrove and said she would be in touch about scheduling the craft sessions. She drove 4 hours back to Natchez without calling me. She said later that she almost called 3 times and stopped herself each time because she did not want to give me something she might have been wrong about. She did not call until she had something worth saying. The second visit was 2 weeks later. She brought materials, construction paper, colored pencils, the props of a person who intended exactly what she said she intended. Bobby Hargrove showed her to the craft room and left her with a staff member who sat near the door and watched her phone. The boy came in with the second group. He took a seat at the end of the table as far from the other children as the room allowed, and accepted the paper and pencils she distributed without making eye contact. Patrice sat down across from him. She said nothing. She took a piece of paper from her own stack and began to draw slowly so that he could see what she was drawing if he happened to look. 7 rows of squares, 37 total, each one subdivided into the smaller shapes of a patchwork pattern. The center square left blank. She set down her pencil and slid the paper across the table without speaking. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at her. His expression did not change the careful neutral of a child who had learned that reactions cost something in a place like that. He looked back down at the drawing. He picked up his pencil. Under the drawing, in handwriting that was careful and small and had clearly been practiced in the absence of anyone telling him it mattered, he wrote 2 words, Vera May. Patrice told me she kept her face still. She folded the paper and put it in her tote bag and ran the craft session for the full remaining hour. She shook Bobby Hargrove's hand at the door and drove back toward Natchez. She called me from the road, still 2 hours out. I stood in my kitchen with the telephone against my ear, and she told me about the drawing she had made and the paper she had slid across the table. And then she read me those 2 words. I sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. Glenn's rental car was in the driveway. I could hear the television from the living room. None of that mattered at that moment. He knew. He remembered. He had kept my name for 3 years in a place no one could reach, and when someone had finally given him a sign that looked like the thing he had been waiting for, he had answered without hesitating. Through Father Beaumont's diocese address in Jackson, I sent James his first letter that Friday. Not a long one, 3 sentences. I know where you are. I am coming for you. You are found always. 3 days later, a drawing came back through the same channel. Not just the quilt pattern this time, a whole scene, a room with a chair and a window and a sewing basket on the floor, the chair with a quilt spread across it, and in the center square of that quilt, written out in the careful pencil handwriting of a boy who had been repeating the words to himself for 3 years so he would not forget them. You are found, always. He had remembered every word. He had been holding them safe for me all this time. Howard Speck arrived with Glenn on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most of the furniture in my living room. He was in his early 50s, small and neat, with the precise manner of a man who had spent decades translating complicated things into simple language for people he expected not to follow along. He introduced himself as Glenn's family estate planner and sat down at my kitchen table and opened his briefcase. Diane had taken Tyler somewhere, a park, a shopping center. I had not paid close attention. Glenn had arranged it that way. Some conversations are easier without children present, which was a thing I had learned in 30 years of school nursing, and which Glenn had apparently learned somewhere else entirely. Howard Speck laid the documents out in order, cover sheet first, the way a man does when he has performed this presentation many times and knows which sequence makes people most comfortable. The basic structure, he said, is what we call a revocable living trust. It is a very common arrangement for people in your situation, Mrs. Tilson. It simply means that your assets are held in the name of the trust rather than in your own name, which provides certain protections and simplifies things considerably for your family, if anything should happen to you. I see, I said. And who would manage this trust? Glenn, as co-trustee, would assist with the day-to-day management. Howard Speck smiled in a way that suggested this was the most natural thing in the world. Given that you have James back now, and given the complexity of reestablishing his legal identity, it makes sense to have someone with financial and legal experience helping to navigate the process. That sounds like a great deal of paperwork, I said. It is, Howard Speck agreed, but that is exactly why we are here. Glenn had said almost nothing since they sat down. He held his coffee cup and his pleasant expression and let Howard Speck do the work, which told me that Howard Speck had been briefed precisely and Glenn trusted him to deliver correctly. I asked questions. Not sharp questions, not questions that would suggest I understood what I was looking at. I asked the kind a woman of my age was expected to ask. Questions about the house, about whether James would be protected, about what Earl would have wanted. Howard Speck answered each one with patience and warmth and the particular gentleness of someone who has been paid to be gentle. I told them I needed a few weeks to think it over. Glenn's expression did not change, but something in the air shifted slightly. The way a room shifts when a window you did not know was open is quietly closed. "Of course," he said. "There is no rush at all." After they left, I sat at the table for approximately 30 seconds. Then I took out my telephone and photographed every page of the documents Howard Speck had left behind. Cover sheet, trust agreement, Exhibit A, listing all property to be conveyed, the house, the 40 acres, everything in the savings account at Citizens Bank, and the signature pages with Glenn's name already typed in the trustee line. I photographed the business card Howard Speck had placed on top of the stack. Howard T. Speck, Estate Planning and Fiduciary Services, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Hattiesburg was 2 hours south, which meant Howard Speck was not Glenn's regular local attorney, but someone brought in for a specific purpose, the way you bring in a particular tool for a particular job. I noted that in the green notebook, along with the license plate number of the car he had arrived in, which was a rental, not a personal vehicle. People who drive rentals to these kinds of meetings do not want to be found afterward. I put the documents back in the order I had found them and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and was standing at the kitchen window when the message came through Father Beaumont's channel. James wrote rarely and briefly. That was a practical constraint. He had limited privacy and limited materials, and so every word he sent me had been weighed before he committed it to paper. I had learned to read his messages the way you read a telegram, knowing that the cost of each word had already been calculated by the person paying it. This message was 5 words. Glenn did this before. Georgia. I read it twice. Then I set the paper down on the counter and stood looking at it. James had been at Sunrise Youth Services for 3 years. Children in residential facilities hear things adults do not mean for them to hear, because adults become careless around children they have decided pose no threat. Whatever James had overheard, a phone call in a hallway, a conversation through a door left open just slightly too far, he had held on to it with the same care he held everything that might matter someday. Georgia. Glenn Hargrove had done something like this before, in another state, with another family, and someone else had lost something they could not get back, which meant James was not the first, which meant Glenn Hargrove had done this before and believed he had gotten away with it cleanly enough to do it again. That was arrogance of a particular kind, the kind that came from watching people grieve and deciding that grief made them manageable. Trails, in my experience, are never as covered as the person who made them believes. I picked up the telephone and called Patrice. "Find out what happened in Georgia," I said. "Find out who it happened to." Patrice found the connection through the most reliable network either of us had ever known, which was the network of church women who had been keeping track of things in the South since before either of us was born. She called her friend Dolores, who knew a woman in Savannah, who knew Rosalie Chambers's daughter, whose name was Carolyn, and who picked up the phone on the second ring when Patrice called. I listened on the extension. Carolyn Chambers was in her late 40s, with the voice of someone who had been angry for a long time and had mostly made peace with carrying it. She asked how we had found her, and Patrice told her a general version, enough to explain without explaining everything, and Carolyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How bad is it where you are?" I told her it had not happened yet, that I was trying to make sure it did not. Another silence. Then, "All right, let me tell you about Glenn Hargrove." Her mother had been 71 when Glenn appeared in her life. Widowed 6 years, living in the house in Savannah where she and her husband had raised 3 children, managing on a fixed income and the proceeds of her husband's life insurance policy. A modest sum, but a comfortable one. Glenn had presented himself as a financial advisor, specializing in estate planning for older women living alone. He had come recommended by someone at Rosalie's church, which Carolyn said later she believed Glenn had arranged deliberately. He was in her life for 8 months before the first document was signed. During those 8 months, he took Rosalie to doctor's appointments and helped with grocery shopping and fixed the screen door that had been broken since the previous September. He was attentive and kind, and he never asked for anything, which was the detail that should have raised concern, and instead raised trust, because people who want something always ask for it eventually, and Glenn never seemed to want anything at all. The trust document came at month 9, a revocable living trust with Glenn named as co-trustee. Rosalie had signed it without showing it to Carolyn, which was something Glenn had arranged over months, emphasizing Rosalie's independence, her right to make her own decisions, gently suggesting that adult children sometimes had interests that did not align with their parents. 18 months after the document was signed, the savings account held $400. The investment portfolio Rosalie's husband had spent 30 years building was gone. Every transaction had Glenn's signature on it in his role as trustee, and every transaction had been technically legal. There was no child in that story, I said. No, Carolyn said. Just my mother and her money, and a man who knew exactly how lonely a widow could be. I sat with that for a moment. Glenn had refined his method. He had added a child to the equation, the miracle of a grandson returned from the dead, because that was a story so large it left no room for suspicion. You did not question a miracle. You wept and signed and thanked God, and never looked too closely at the man who had arranged for the miracle to arrive. With Rosalie, he had relied on loneliness alone. With me, he was relying on grief, which was loneliness made worse by loss, which he had apparently decided was more reliable. He was not wrong that grief was more powerful than simple loneliness. He was wrong about who he was using it on, and he was wrong to assume that a woman who had outlived a husband and a son and a grandson had done so by being easy to manage. Carolyn told us about Sandra Fitch. She was a state investigator in the Attorney General's Office Financial Crimes Division. She had looked at Rosalie's case in Georgia and a similar case in Florida the year before, and she had understood what had happened in both of them, and she had not been able to prove enough of either to bring charges. Glenn had been too careful. Everything signed, everything documented, everything technically within what a trustee was authorized to do. She tried, Carolyn said. She genuinely tried. But she told me that without another case, a pattern, there was nothing to be done. I asked for Sandra Fitch's number. That evening, I called her from the sewing room, with the door closed and the television on in the living room, where Glenn and Diane were watching something I could hear but not see. Sandra Fitch answered on the first ring, which told me she kept her phone close. I told her my name and what was happening in Natchez. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked 3 questions. How long Glenn had been in my house, what documents he had presented, and whether I had copies. I have photographs of everything I told her, every page. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Tilson, I have been waiting for this man's next case for 2 years. I would very much like to build something he cannot walk away from. I said, "That is exactly what I intend to give you." Before we hung up, she asked one more question. "Can you keep playing your role a little longer?" I looked across the room at the quilt on the sewing chair. The center square, with its 7 words in yellow thread, words that a boy in Alabama had memorized so carefully that he had been able to draw them from memory 3 years later without a single letter wrong. "As long as it takes," I told her. "That is something I have had some practice with." The plan. "And James," I said. She looked at me steadily. "If James is present at the right moment, identified by competent authority as the real James Earl Tilson, not the boy Glenn brought, then we have fraud and false identification of a minor and child endangerment layered on top of the financial charges. The case becomes something a jury understands in their bones, not just on paper." I told her about Deputy Marvell Cole, whom I had known from First Baptist for 22 years. He was 52 and deliberate in the way of people who had long ago decided that careful was better than fast. He had known Earl. He had come to Marcus's funeral and stood in the back and not said much, which was the kind of presence I had always respected. Sandra said she would need him to coordinate the local arrest. Her jurisdiction covered the investigation, but she needed a Mississippi law enforcement officer to execute the warrant on state grounds. I said I would talk to him. Cole was the kind of man who, when he understood what was being asked of him and why, would simply say yes and mean it, and not require the conversation to be any longer than that. I drove back to Natchez in the early evening with the windows down and October moving through the car. The plan had a shape now. It had pieces and timing and people positioned to do the necessary things. What it still needed was the final document signed and James brought safely home and into a room where Glenn could not control what happened next. I thought about the 40 acres outside town that Earl's father had bought in 1951, and that had sat growing in value for 70 years, while 3 generations of Tilsons lived their lives without concerning themselves about it. I thought about the filing cabinet Glenn's eyes kept finding. I thought about a woman named Rosalie Chambers in Savannah, who had trusted a charming man and lost everything her husband had spent his life building. 90 miles of highway in the October dark, thinking about what it meant to be almost ready. When I got home, there was a message through Father Beaumont's channel, relayed from the diocese number in Jackson, waiting on my telephone answering machine. Father Beaumont's voice, reading words that were not his. "Mrs. Tilson, the boy says it is important. He says it is about Diane." I stood in my kitchen in my coat and listened to that message twice. About Diane, not about Glenn, not about the facility, not about the documents or the trust or anything I had been tracking in the green notebook for weeks. About Diane. I set down my keys and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the blue dress and the hug that wanted something and the way Diane's eyes moved when she thought I was not watching. Whatever James had learned about Diane was in a letter that would not arrive until Friday. 4 days was a very long time to wait when you were sleeping under the same roof as the people you were building a case against. The letter from James came on Friday. It came through Father Beaumont's channel, the way they all did, relayed through the diocese address in Jackson, forwarded as a notification that mail was waiting at the church office. I went Friday morning while Glenn and Diane were at the county courthouse handling the paperwork for who they were pretending was James. Father Beaumont handed me the envelope without a word. His expression said he had not read the contents and had no intention of doing so, but that whatever was inside had arrived with a weight he could feel through the paper. I took it home and went to my bedroom and closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. James's handwriting was careful and small, the way it had always been. He had been a deliberate child, someone who approached the page with the seriousness of a person who understood that words did not take themselves back. He had written on 3 pieces of paper, torn from the same notebook, front and back, which told me that what he had to say required space. "I am going to tell you something," he wrote at the top of the first page. "I should have told you sooner, but I did not know if you would want to know. I know now that you would want to know." 6 months after the fire, he wrote, "Diane came to Sunrise Youth Services. She came alone, without Bobby or Glenn. She was wearing a gray dress, and her hair was down, and she looked," James wrote, "like she had not been sleeping well," which he noted because it seemed like information. She asked for him by the name they were using, and a staff member brought him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs, and she sat across from him. She told him that his grandmother knew he was alive. I read that sentence twice. She told him that Vera Mae Tilson knew he was alive and had asked Diane to come explain things in person. She said Vera had a new life now, and things were complicated, and what had happened could not be undone. That Vera had said it was better this way, that James was too much for her to manage alone, that she was sorry, but this was what Vera wanted, and he needed to start accepting it. James wrote, "I believed her. I don't know why I believed her. I think I believed her because I was 8 years old and she was an adult, and she said your name like she knew you. And I had been in that place for 6 months, and I was very tired." He wrote, "I stopped drawing the quilt for a while after that, not because I forgot it, because it hurt to look at it." He wrote, "Then the woman with the notebook came and put the drawing on the table, and I saw it, and I knew." I sat on the edge of my bed with those 3 pieces of paper, and I let myself understand fully what Diane had done. She had driven to that facility and sat across a table from an 8-year-old boy, and she had used my name like a weapon. She had taken 33 years of being my daughter-in-law, every holiday meal and hospital waiting room, an ordinary Tuesday we had ever shared, and she had turned all of it into the cruelest lie a child could be told. Too much for her. That was what she had said, that James was too much for me. I went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists, the way I had done since nursing school when something was very bad, and I allowed myself 2 minutes. I stood over the sink, and I did not make any noise. Then I washed my face and dried my hands and went back out to the kitchen to start dinner. Glenn was in the living room, reading something on his phone. Tyler was at the kitchen table with a glass of juice, doing the kind of nothing the children do when they are waiting for permission to do something else. Diane was in the backyard, looking at the garden, or looking at nothing, I did not know which, and had decided it did not matter. I made pork chops and collard greens and cornbread, which was what Earl had always wanted on Fridays, and I set the table for 4 and called everyone in and sat down and passed the food and listened to Glenn talk about nothing in particular. Diane ate with her eyes mostly on her plate. I had spent weeks watching her perform the role of a woman reunited with family she had thought was lost. The careful tears at the right moments. The gratitude that surfaced whenever I said something warm about James. the tenderness she performed when Tyler walked into a room. I understood now that she had not been manipulated into this. She had not been a woman who loved her child and made a terrible choice under pressure. She had gotten into a car and driven to Decatur, Alabama, and sat across a table from her son and looked him in the eye and told him I did not want him. She had chosen it. Every time since then that she had touched Tyler's shoulder and called him James and accepted my coffee and sat in my sewing room while I spread the quilt, she had known exactly what she had done. I poured everyone more water and asked Glenn if he wanted more cornbread, and he said yes, and I got up and got it. The mask held. It had to hold a little while longer. The message from James that arrived the following week was different from the others. The others had been informational, what he had overheard, what he had observed, the details that might be useful. This one was about Tyler. James wrote that Glenn had brought Tyler to Sunrise Youth Services 3 times before the Natchez plan began. Bobby Hargrove had arranged it as a supervised visit, presenting it to the staff as a volunteer mentorship program, which Bobby apparently had the authority to authorize and the indifference to arrange without asking many questions. Glenn's intention had been straightforward. Tyler needed to learn enough about James to be convincing. What Glenn had not accounted for was what James would say when given time alone with a boy his own age. He did not tell Tyler how to perform, James wrote. He told Tyler about me. He told Tyler about the sweet potato biscuits and the quilt and the way the sewing room smelled like cedar and lavender. He told Tyler about the NICU, the story Vera had told him when he was old enough to understand it. 3 weeks in an incubator, a grandmother who sat beside it every day with a sewing basket because her hands needed something to do. He told Tyler about the angel mark on his right wrist and what Vera had called it the first time she saw it. He told Tyler about the words in the center square of the quilt, what they meant, and why only 2 people in the world knew them. James wrote, I don't know why I told him all of that. I think I wanted someone to know. He wrote, after the second visit, Tyler asked me if my grandmother was really like that, or if I was making it up. I told him she was really like that. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said his mother had never stitched anything into anything for him. He wrote, I think Tyler wants to leave. I think he has wanted to leave since the first week. But he is more afraid of his father than anything else. I thought you should know. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and sat in the sewing room for a long time. Tyler Hargrove was 11 years old. He had been brought here by his father and told to perform a role in a plan that no 11-year-old could have designed or chosen. He had walked into this house and eaten my biscuits and sat in my kitchen and looked at my quilt from doorways. And every day since then, he had been carrying something no child should carry. I had watched him across the dinner table and noted his tiredness and his careful posture. And I had thought of him primarily as a variable to be managed. I had not thought of him as a boy who had been told his mother never stitched anything into anything for him. I sat with that for a while. Then I thought about the night James was born and what I had believed sitting beside that incubator about what children needed from the people who loved them. I thought about a boy who had spent weeks in my kitchen eating food I made and looking at a quilt he knew he did not belong to. I took out a piece of paper and I wrote him a letter. It was not a long letter. I was not certain how much Glenn monitored Tyler's mail, and so I kept it brief in plain language, the kind of letter that read like nothing if a stranger found it. Tyler, I wrote, I know who you are. I know you are scared. I know you did not choose this, and I know that being asked to do something wrong by someone you love and fear does not make you a bad person. It makes you a child in an impossible situation. I need your help to bring James home. In return, I promise you this. When it is over, I will tell anyone who needs to hear it that you did the right thing when it mattered. I will make sure you are safe. Whatever comes next for you, it will not be because of what you choose to do now. You are 11 years old, and you have been carrying something very heavy. I am asking you to carry it a little while longer. I signed it Vera Mae Tilson and sent it through Father Beaumont that same afternoon. James told me later, in a letter that came after everything was over, what had happened when Tyler read it. He had been in the guest room, the room that had always been the guest room, that had never been James's room, because James had never slept in it. He sat on the edge of the bed and read the letter, and then put it down on the mattress and put his face in his hands. It was the first time he had cried since arriving in Natchez. I had not known that then. I only knew that I had written a letter to the son of the man who had stolen my grandson and set fire to a house and placed a child's remains in a cemetery with James's name on the headstone. I had written to that man's son with genuine care for what that boy was carrying, and I had asked him to carry it further. A 12-year-old boy was the only person who could break this open from the inside. I had just asked him to do exactly that. Sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing, and you hold them both and you go forward anyway. I had done it before. I knew how. I went to the kitchen and started on supper, and waited to hear back from a boy who was deciding whether to trust a grandmother he had never met. Tyler found me in the sewing room on a Tuesday morning. Glenn and Diane had gone to meet with Howard Speck about the final document preparation. They had mentioned it over breakfast casually, the way people mention an errand when they have decided you do not need to know the details. I had said that sounded fine and poured myself more coffee and not let my hands move any faster than usual. When their car left the driveway, Tyler came to the sewing room door. He knocked, which the others never did. Glenn walked through my house like it already belonged to him, and Diane moved through it like a woman who had stopped noticing where she was. Tyler knocked on the door frame and waited. "Come in," I said. He was wearing the too large jacket he had arrived with, though the morning was not cold. He stood just inside the door and looked at the quilt on the chair, and then at me. "I know you got my letter," I said. "You don't have to explain anything." He nodded. Then he said, "I know when they want you to sign." He said it the way a child says something they have rehearsed quickly before they can change their mind. "The 14th, he said. "Mr. Speck is coming back. Glenn wants it done before the end of the month because he says there are financial matters that need to be resolved before the new year." He said it exactly the way Glenn would have said it. Financial matters, the new year. And I understood that Tyler had been listening to Glenn talk for a very long time. "I have it written down," I said. "Thank you." He looked at the quilt again. "Is James really like that?" he asked, "the way he told me about himself?" I looked at him directly. "Every word," I said. He nodded once. He looked like he wanted to say something else and then decided not to. He went back out to the living room and I heard the television come on a moment later. I sat in the sewing room for a minute after he left, thinking about a boy who had memorized a bank account number in a doorway because he had decided at 11 years old that it was the right thing to do. Then I went to the green notebook and wrote down the 14th and underlined it twice. That afternoon I called Sandra Fitch. I have a date, I told her, the 14th, 2 weeks. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone calculating. Then I can have the warrant ready in 10 days. I need Glenn's account information to flag with the bank before then. Tyler had mentioned an account number that morning. He had not written it down. He had no paper, but he had repeated it to me 4 times in the sewing room doorway until I had it memorized the way he had memorized things about James. Carefully, because he understood that some information mattered and you did not lose it. I gave Sandra the number. She read it back to me. "Correct," I said. "I will contact the bank today," she said. And the boy, James. The logistics of bringing James from Alabama to Mississippi legally, given that he was officially registered as deceased in the state records, were not simple. Sandra had been working on the paperwork for 2 weeks through the State Child Welfare Office, an identity correction, and emergency custody transfer that required a family court judge to sign an expedited order. She had arranged it through a judge she described only as someone who understood what she was looking at when she put the file in front of them. Patrice would bring James to Natchez on the morning of the 13th. She would keep him at Father Beaumont's rectory overnight. On the 14th, she would bring him to my house at a time Sandra and Deputy Cole would coordinate between them. Cole I called last. He answered on the second ring. The 14th, I told him. He said, "I will have 2 officers. We will be on Liberty Road, 2 blocks west. You give us the signal, and we come." I said, "I will give you the signal." That was the whole conversation. Marvel Cole was exactly the man I had told Sandra he was. I was finishing supper when Glenn called. His voice was warm and pleased, the way it always was when things were going according to his plans, which they were, though not the plans he believed they were. "Mrs. Tilson," he said. He had never asked to call me Vera, which was a detail I had noted in the green notebook in the first week, because a man who spends months coming and going from your house without asking to use your given name is a man who has decided you are a transaction. I wanted to let you know we have confirmed the signing for the 14th. Howard will come at 10 o'clock. I think after this is settled, you are going to feel so much better about everything. "I am sure I will," I said. "I cannot tell you how much I am looking forward to it." He said good night. I said good night. I hung up the telephone and stood in the kitchen with my hand still on the receiver for a moment. The man who had taken James, who had set a fire and arranged a burial, and spent 3 years believing he had made a child disappear cleanly, had just called to tell me the date and time of his own undoing. I went back to the pot on the stove. Supper was not going to make itself, and there were still 13 nights between now and the 14th. The trap and the escape. That evening, Glenn and Diane ordered delivery food and ate in the guest bedroom with the door closed, and I could hear them through the wall, their voices low and pleased with the particular pleasure of people who believe they have won something. There was laughter once, and then quiet conversation, and then the television. I washed the dishes I had used for my own supper and dried them and put them away, and then I put on my coat and walked to First Baptist. Father Beaumont was in his office at the back of the church, which I had known he would be because I had called ahead and asked him to wait. He stood when I came in and did not say anything at first, just gestured to the chair across from his desk, and I sat down. I told him what was going to happen in the morning. Not all of it. He did not need all of it, but enough. James arriving at the rectory tonight, the signing at 10. What would happen after? He listened the way he always listened, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned over many years that most of what people need is simply to be heard. When I finished, he said, "Is there anything you need from me tonight?" I said, "I think I just needed to say it out loud to someone who would not tell anyone else." He nodded. Then he said, "Vera, I have been a priest for 35 years, and I have sat with a great many people the night before something hard. You are one of the steadiest I have seen do it." I thanked him, and meant it, and walked home in the October dark. The street was quiet, the pecan trees along Liberty Road moving slightly in the wind, the neighborhood going to sleep around me, the way it did every night, regardless of what was happening in any particular house on any particular street. I had lived here for 42 years, and the street had always looked like this at this hour. And tomorrow it would look like this again, and that constancy was something I was grateful for. Patrice had called while I was out. Her message on the answering machine was brief. "We are on the road. We will be there by 9. He is fine. He sends his love." I stood in the kitchen and listened to her say those last 4 words, "He sends his love," and I put my hand flat on the counter and held it there for a moment. Sandra Fitch had sent a brief message through the secure channel she had established weeks ago. "Warrant is signed, bank notified, everything is in position." Cole had left a single line on my telephone, 2 blocks west, 7:45. I went to the sewing room and sat down in the chair. A small piece of paper appeared under the door sometime around 9 o'clock. I heard Tyler's footsteps in the hall, and then silence, and I reached down and picked it up. One word in his careful handwriting. "Ready." I set the paper on the side table. Then I spread the quilt across my lap and looked at it in the lamplight. 37 squares, 7 rows each, one a piece of someone I had loved. Earl's blue Sunday shirt along the left border faded from 30 years of washing to the color of an afternoon sky. Marcus's high school letter jacket, the green felt, worn, soft. A scrap of curtain from the bedroom where Earl and I had slept for 4 decades. My mother's tablecloth, lace. James's first pajamas, yellow with small white stars, worn nearly transparent because James had refused to give them up until he was 4 years old. And in the center, the square I had cut from James's hospital bracelet, the paper one they put on newborns, which I had asked the nurse if I could keep, and she had looked at me with the understanding of someone who had seen grandmothers before and said, "Of course." I had folded it into the square and stitched it under the ivory fabric so no one would know it was there. James did not know it was there. It was the one thing I had never told him. All of it leading to the center square. Ivory fabric, yellow thread. 7 words I had chosen in a hospital room on the worst night of my life that had turned into the most important night of my life, the night I understood what it meant to be found and what it meant to keep finding. I ran my finger along each letter the way James used to do. You are found always. Tomorrow, a boy who had spent 3 years believing I had abandoned him would walk through my front door. I had not slept well in many months, and I expected I would not sleep tonight either, and that was all right. Some things were worth sitting up for. 30 years of nursing had taught me many things about the moment before something significant happens, about the particular stillness of a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, about the way time slows when you are waiting for something you cannot rush, about what it feels like to be fully ready and to know it, and to simply wait for the event to catch up with your preparation. The moment before everything changes feels exactly like silence. I sat in the sewing room with the quilt across my lap and the piece of paper on the table beside me, and the house around me full of people who did not know what morning was coming for them. The 14th arrived in silence. Howard Speck arrived at 9:55, 5 minutes early, which was the kind of detail that told you something about the man. Glenn let him in. Diane was already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she was not drinking. Tyler sat across from her with his hands in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. I had been up since 5. I had made coffee and biscuits and set the table properly with the good cups and the cloth napkins I used for Thanksgiving, because I had decided that if this was going to be the last morning Glenn Hargrove ate at my table, he was going to eat at a table set with respect for what the occasion actually was. I had ironed the napkins the night before. Earl had always said that the way you set a table told people how you felt about the meal you were serving them. Howard Speck sat at the far end and opened his briefcase and laid the documents out in the order I had seen him use before. Glenn sat to my left with his coffee comfortable and settled the face of a man who had run a long race and could see the finish. He talked about the weather and the economy, and said something about James going back to school in the new year and how much he was looking forward to seeing the boy settled. He said it like a man who had been rehearsing the version of the future where he was the one who had made things right, the one who had helped a grieving grandmother and reunited a family. He had been telling that story to himself for a long time. I agreed with everything and refilled his coffee. The documents were arranged. Howard Speck clicked his pen. Glenn set down his coffee cup and looked at me with the expression of a man about to complete a transaction he had been working toward for a long time. "Before we do anything," I said, "I want James to hold his quilt." Glenn looked at me. "I made it the week he was born," I said. "I bring it out for important occasions. It is just a small thing." "Of course," Glenn said. He said it the way he said everything, smoothly, without friction, because a man who refuses a grandmother a small, sentimental gesture before a signing looks like a man with something to hide. And Glenn was very careful about how things looked. I went to the sewing room and came back with the quilt folded over my arm. I spread it across the kitchen table, slowly moving the coffee cups aside to give it room, smoothing the edges the way I had smoothed them 1,000 times, letting it settle flat so every square lay in its proper order and the center panel faced upward toward the ceiling light. The ivory fabric and the yellow thread were very visible in the morning light. Howard Speck moved his documents to the side with the patience of a professional who had learned to accommodate whatever made clients feel comfortable signing things. I pushed the quilt toward Tyler. He sat still for a moment. Glenn had picked up the trust agreement and was reading through the final page, a man doing a last review of something he had already decided. Diane was looking toward the window. Howard Speck was aligning his pen on the table. Nobody was watching Tyler. Tyler stood up. He placed both hands flat on the quilt, palms down, the way you place your hands when you are about to say something and you need to be steady for it. He looked at the center square. the ivory fabric, the yellow thread. He read the words aloud. You are found always. The room went still. Glenn looked up from the document. His eyes went to Tyler, then to the quilt, then to the center square and the words there. Something moved across his face that I had not seen in all the weeks he had been in my house. Not alarm exactly, not yet, but the calculation that comes before alarm, the first flash of a man realizing that something is not where he left it. How do you know that? Glenn said. His voice came out flat, stripped clean of the warmth that lived there ordinarily. Tyler looked at his father. James told me, he said. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Glenn's hand to tighten on the document he was holding, long enough for Howard Speck to look between them with the expression of a man who had been prepared for many contingencies and had not been prepared for this one. Long enough for Diane to set her coffee cup down on the table with a sound that was very small in a room that had gone very quiet. Glenn's eyes moved to me. For the first time in all the weeks he had sat at my table and eaten my food and looked at my filing cabinet and spoken to me in the warm, efficient voice of a man performing kindness, Glenn Hargrove looked at me and understood that something had gone wrong. Not what, not yet, just that the ground beneath him was not what he had believed it was when he arrived this morning, and had not been for some time, and that the woman across the table from him, the one he had spent weeks managing, accommodating, performing, patience and kindness for, was not who he had decided she was. I held his gaze and said nothing. 20 years of school nursing, 30 years before that, of simply paying attention, had taught me that there are moments when silence is the most precise instrument available. This was one of those moments. The front door opened. Patrice came through the door first. She stepped inside and moved to the side, the way people move when they are making room for something more important than themselves. And then James walked in. He was 11 years old and taller than I had imagined from the drawings. Lean and careful, the way Marcus had been at that age, with dark hair that had grown long and eyes that were brown and steady and very old for an 11-year-old face. He was wearing clean clothes that were slightly too big, which told me Patrice had found him something on short notice and had done her best. He had his hands at his sides, and he was not looking at me. He was looking at the quilt on the table. He walked across the room without hesitation, the way someone walks toward something they have been navigating toward for a very long time. He did not stop to look at Glenn. He did not look at Tyler or Diane or Howard Speck. He walked to the kitchen table, and he reached out his right hand and placed it flat on the center square of the quilt. His right wrist was turned upward as he reached. The port wine stain was exactly where it had always been. Deep reddish purple, the size of a silver dollar, the capillaries arranged in the pattern that belonged to him and no one else. Not smooth all the way around, not applied. Born there the way it had been born the night he came into the world, and I had looked at it and said, "This one matters. Hold on to this one." James's hand rested on the center square, and he did not look down to find it. He knew where it was. He had always known where it was. I walked around the table and stood beside him and did not say anything for a moment. There was nothing that needed to be said first. 3 years of silence had their own weight and their own shape, and you could not speak over them. You had to let them be there for a moment before you said anything else. Then I put my hand over his the way I used to do when he was small, and we stood at the sewing chair together, and I said, "I found you." James looked up at me. His eyes were wet, but his face was still the composure of a child who had learned to hold things carefully for a very long time. "I knew you would," he said. Behind me I heard the door, and Deputy Cole came in with 2 officers, and Sandra Fitch came in after them, and the room that had been very quiet a moment before now had more people in it than it was designed for, which was all right. It was all right. Glenn was standing when Cole reached him. He had set the trust agreement down on the table with precise care, the gesture of a man who was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure entirely. He submitted to the handcuffs without speaking. A man like Glenn had already begun calculating his next move before the cuffs were on, and there was nothing to be gained by making a scene. Howard Speck closed his briefcase. He did not look at any of us as he walked out. I had a feeling Howard Speck would be very careful for some time about the clients he agreed to represent. Diane was the one I watched. She stood when the officers came in, and her eyes went to James, and she looked at him for 3 seconds, which was the first time she had looked at her son in 3 years. And then she looked at the floor. She did not speak. The officer beside her did not need to take her arm because she walked toward the door on her own. She did not look back. That was the choice she had made, and that was what it looked like. I turned back to James. He was still standing with his hand on the center square of the quilt, his eyes following the room with the careful watchfulness of a child who had learned not to trust that good things stayed. I put my arms around him and felt him hesitate for just a moment, the pause of a boy who had been told too many times that the people he loved were not coming. And then he put his face against my shoulder and held on. He was thin. He was 11 years old, and he had spent 3 years in a place where people called him by the wrong name, and he was thin and tired, and he smelled like the soap Patrice used, and he was real, and he was here, and he was home, and he was mine. We stood like that for a while. The room continued around us, Cole speaking quietly into his radio, Sandra gathering the trust documents as evidence, Patrice standing near the door with her hands folded and her face doing the thing it did when she was trying not to cry. At some point, I looked over his shoulder and saw Tyler sitting alone in the corner, watching everything with the stillness of a boy who had done something and was waiting to find out what it cost. I met his eyes. I nodded once. He had kept his word. I had kept mine. Whatever came next for Tyler Hargrove, it would not be because of what he had chosen to do in this room on this morning. He looked back at me for a moment. Then something in his face released just slightly, like a knot that had been very tight for a very long time, loosening by 1 degree. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of justice moved with a thoroughness I had not dared hope for. Glenn Hargrove was charged with elder financial fraud, forgery, false imprisonment of a minor, and child endangerment. Diane faced the same charges, plus conspiracy. Their trial was set for the following spring, which was further than I would have liked. But Sandra Fitch told me the strength of the case made the outcome as certain as these things could be, and I chose to believe her. Bobby Hargrove surrendered his license to operate Sunrise Youth Services before any formal action could be taken. The kind of calculation men like Bobby made when they understood that cooperation was their best available option. The facility closed in November, and the children in its care were placed with licensed providers while the state conducted a full review. Rosalie Chambers's daughter, Carolyn, called me in December. Some portion of the funds Glenn had moved through shell accounts had been frozen and were in the process of being returned. Not all of it, Carolyn said, but enough to matter. I told her I was glad. She said she hoped I knew what my letter to the investigator's office had meant to her mother. For Tyler, I wrote a letter to the family court judge assigned to his case. I told the judge what Tyler had done and why it had mattered, and I asked that his choice be weighed accordingly. Sandra Fitch told me later it had been read into the record. Tyler was placed with a foster family in Jackson and enrolled in the 7th grade. He sent me a card at Christmas. It said, "Thank you for keeping your promise." I have it on my sewing room wall. James came home on a Thursday in November, which was an ordinary day that felt like nothing I had words for. His room was exactly as it had been. I had not changed anything, not the books on the shelf, or the model on the desk, or the lamp with the blue shade that he had chosen himself at the hardware store when he was 7 years old, 1 week before the fire. I had dusted it every week for 3 years, because someone had to, and because it was the only thing I could do that felt like keeping faith. I had made one change. The quilt was on his bed. He stood in the doorway when I showed him, looking at it for a long moment. Then he went in and sat on the edge of the mattress and ran his hand over the center square the way he always had, following the letters with his fingertips. He looked up at me. "Grandma," he said, "how did you know about Tyler? How did you know he wasn't me?" I sat down beside him. 30 years of reading what bodies cannot lie about, I said. Your angel mark is yours alone, born with you, arranged the way only yours is arranged. No one can reproduce that. I held your wrist 100 times when you were small. I knew the difference in 3 seconds. He thought about this. Then what if you hadn't brought the quilt out? What if Tyler hadn't read it? I looked at the center square. Then I would have found another way, I said. I had already found you once. I was not going to stop. James nodded the way he nodded when something had settled for him. He lay back on the bed and pulled the quilt up over his chest and looked at the ceiling. "You are found always," he said quietly, not asking, just saying it the way you say something you have been keeping safe for a long time and can finally put down. "Yes," I said, "always." I sat beside him until he fell asleep, which did not take long. He slept the way his father had slept, completely like sleep was something he trusted. The quilt rose and fell with his breathing. Outside, Earl's pecan trees moved in the November wind. I thought about Earl, who had built this house with his own hands and never knew he was building a place that would someday need to hold this much. I thought about Marcus, who had his father's laugh and his mother's stubbornness, and a son who carried both. I thought about 3 years of sitting in the sewing room with a quilt across my lap, fingers moving over the letters, keeping a promise to someone who did not yet know the promise was being kept. Being found is not a single moment. It is a promise that has to be renewed. You are found today, and you must be found again tomorrow. And it is the finding that matters more than the state of having been found. I had renewed it every day for 3 years without knowing if it would be enough. It was enough. James was home. The quilt was on his bed. To you listening tonight, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to trust what you knew over what you were being told? Have you ever kept faith when every sign said it was gone? Have you ever loved someone who did not know you were still looking for them? Trust what you know. Trust the things that cannot be faked. Not a birthmark born with a child. Not 7 words stitched by a grandmother's hand the night her grandson fought to breathe. Not love. Never love. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you have a story of your own about faith or family or the things that held when everything else broke, I would be honored to read it in the comments. You are not alone in whatever you are carrying.